What are some of the scams that are done by the Mafia? Let's get right into it. Number 3, the world's worst gambler. MGM Grand, a casino based in Detroit, was declared not responsible for a gambler losing up to $6 million in investor funds at its tables. Gino Acatola, the gambler in question, was treated like royalty when he gambled at the MGM Grand. The casino extended extra lines of credit to him and gave him discounted rooms and even free meals. All of this made Acatola so comfortable that he went on to gamble away around $6 million. But the casino didn't just give him discounted rooms and extra lines of credit. They also waived the right to do a background check on Acatola. If they had, the MGM may have discovered that Acatola was gambling with investors' funds. They may have realized that Acatola had no other employment, no other sources of income, and was living large off the dime of others. They also may have discovered his criminal history involving identity theft and grand larceny. But since the MGM was both greedy and lazy, Acatola had everything he needed to lose millions. Before Acatola got into gambling away investors' funds, he was involved in petty crime, even having a stint in prison in the 1990s. His more recent criminal involvement was in 2013 when he pled guilty in a Macomb County court to fraud-related offenses, getting a 10-month suspended sentence for his efforts. But that didn't teach Acatola a lesson. Instead, he continued to commit all sorts of crimes. He eventually met his Waterloo when he got carried away and gambled all of his investors' funds. You might be wondering how Acatola got these investments in the first place. Well, Acatola was a skilled salesman who could convince many people to loan him money for his business. He promised abnormally high short-term returns and claimed the money invested would go into commercial construction projects in Michigan and Florida. But Acatola was lying. A lot of these projects didn't exist, and what he was actually doing was an elaborate ruse. To perpetuate his lies, he provided his would-be investors with fraudulent emails, contracts, and payout schedules concerning the projects. In the end, he was able to source around $6 million from investors. Our con man didn't just try his hands at defrauding investors. He also tried to defraud his friends too. Acatola owned about 5 tanning salons in Miami. His companies used Interlink, a middleman payment gateway, to process payments. He convinced his friend, who was the owner of Interlink, to raise the limit for his processing credit card refunds for an allegedly defective tanning product. This meant that Interlink would process refunds for that product, and the tanning locations would reimburse Interlink. However, the tanning businesses never repaid Interlink, and Acatola managed to scam them for about $200,000. Now that Acatola had all of this money he'd swindled, he had enough cash to spend on what he loved doing, which of course was gambling with someone else's money. Acatola's casino of choice was MGM Grand Detroit, where they treated him like complete royalty. Surprisingly, Acatola was an extremely bad blackjack player. One would expect a fraudster to be better at gambling, but Acatola was a complete exception to that rule. He lost money all day long, and MGM Grand encouraged him to continue playing. The casino gave him everything he needed: lines of credit, discounted rooms and meals, and whatever else to make him happy despite losing money. As his losses began to mount and MGM Grand continued to extend his credit, it reached a threshold where the casino was given permission to access to his background data. Because they extended him a long line of credit, they could legally check his background and see whether he was worthy of loaning to. But the MGM Grand did not check, and as such, didn't realize that he was gambling investors' funds away. Since Acatola was the worst gambler on the planet, MGM Casino might have had every reason not to check his background. One might even say they had every incentive to make sure he continued playing for as long as he could. In any case, Acatola was eventually arrested and charged in court for his crimes. But this didn't mark the end of his crime saga. Despite being found guilty, Akatola managed to convince the judge to sentence him to only a year in jail if he agreed to pay back a large portion of his loot. The proposed 1-year sentence was below the 6-year sentencing guidelines that the judge ought to have followed. So instead, the judge offered a reduced sentence if Akatola repaid $50,000, but Akatola couldn't even find money for that. The judge eventually just gave Akatola the 7-year sentence that was in the sentencing guidelines anyway. While his victims understood that Akatola's incarceration meant they would never see their money again, they were also glad that he was paying for his crimes. Was our con man ever remorseful? Not really. While he gave a short apology in court, his victim said he hadn't shown an ounce of remorse for his actions. Number 2. From Russia without love. Alex Golant was an auto broker who used straw buyers to falsify financing applications and defraud local car dealers. Golant's scheme was to obtain money from investors and financial institutions through false pretenses and then use the money however he wanted. Golant took money from at least 40 victims, claiming that their money would be used to purchase and export luxury vehicles to China. Golant also secured financing from financial institutions using fraudulent documents and straw borrowers who were working for Golant's scheme behind the scenes. And he did all of this while on the run from the United States government and the Russian mob. If Golant wasn't such a horrible fraudster, one might have been impressed by his ability to get on the bad side of the mafia and the law at the same time. He found himself in a situation where he could either accept up to 50 years of jail time with the US government or a nasty fate with the Russian mob. Which path did he take? Let's find out. Golant was a man of many scams and schemes who loved to run his fraud through multiple channels so that he would have multiple fault lines. Golant created a business called Timeless Auto Group to set up his scheme to recruit straw borrowers from around the country. These straw borrowers would visit dealerships that sold luxury cars like Range Rovers, Maseratis, Mercedes-Benz GLS 450s, and 550s. These dealerships would end up selling the luxury vehicles, and the straw borrowers would agree to a 6-year financing agreement with them. This agreement was usually brokered by a company called Ally Financial. The borrowers would turn the vehicle over to Golant, who would have them shipped to buyers outside the country within a month. When Ally Financial discovered the scam, it had lost over $300,000 to Golant's fraud. Here's where things get a little dicey. Ally Financial took the case to court, and it ended up being dismissed for unclear reasons. Aside from his straw buying operation, Golant also managed to convince over 40 victims to invest in Timeless Auto Group. Unfortunately for those investors, Golant didn't use the money to purchase vehicles. Instead, he turned the operation into an elaborate Ponzi scheme and used the money to support a lavish lifestyle. Golant flew all over the country in private jets to engage in high-stakes betting at exclusive casinos. He also lived in a house he rented for $10,000 per month and paid professional gamblers to play for him, and then used whatever was left over of investors' funds to settle gambling debts that he had accumulated. This wasn't Golant's first rodeo either. He had been previously convicted of fraud in a similar auto brokering scheme in New York, but Golant wasn't sentenced for it until he helped the FBI make a racketeering case against 2 members of the Russian Mafia. After testifying against them, he was sentenced to 3 years of supervised release. And it was under this supervised release period that he started this new straw borrower slash Ponzi scheme slash all-around fraud guy act. When he realized that the feds were on his tail during his supervised release, he fled. But Golant couldn't remain on the lam, as the long arm of the law eventually caught up with him. His trial was conducted, and the court sentenced him to 126 months in jail. Number 1. Punishing sinners? Zain Qaiser blackmailed thousands of, let's call them, adult film purveyors worldwide out of about £4 million. At the time Zain got sentenced, he was the most prolific cyber criminal to be sentenced in the United Kingdom. According to the court, Zain's crimes were so extensive that the criminal justice system had simply never seen anything like it. Zain was just recently sentenced, but he was arrested for his crimes about 5 years ago. However, due to the complexity of the investigation and mental health concerns, his trial has been delayed. So how did Zain manage to scam all these investors to these sites? Let's just say he had some help. Zain first started in cybercrime journey by making money off ransomware attacks, viruses that freeze up the victim's computer until a ransom was paid. After a while, Zain became bold. He contacted the Russian controller of an extremely potent cyber attack tool with the promise that he would split his profits with them if his planned mass blackmail operation was successful. To further cement his operation, he also forged connections with Chinese and American cybercriminals who could help him move the cash without it leading back to him. Once he was done with those preparations, the operation itself began. Zain bought advertising space on sites and put malicious links on the ads. The links were set up so that people who clicked on them would immediately download some malware named Angler. If the victim's laptop didn't have great antivirus systems in place, Angler would deliver a virus to the computer that would seize the entire system. Once control was established, the malware would display a notice that told the victim that the FBI had seized the computer. The message said that the seizure was in light of the user's crimes watching these videos. In the same message, the user would be informed that if they didn't pay around a £100 fine, they would be charged to court and could be imprisoned for up to 3 years. This was usually enough motivation for most users to pay the purported fee. The companies that Zain purchased these ads from were wholly unaware of his nefarious actions. The scam was extremely successful and Zain made a lot of money. Law enforcement officials still aren't sure of just how Zain made, but managed a rough estimate of at least $4 billion. And what did Zain spend the money on? Well, he called himself the king, if that's any indication. He spent the bulk of his cash on high-end hotels, women, gambling, drugs, and a £5,000 Rolex watch. Most of his victims simply paid the ransom. Rather than going to the police, getting malware from an adult site isn't something most people want to admit. But how was Zain finally caught if the victims never went to the police? The simple truth is that Zain had too strong of a hand. After he'd been at his business for a while, one of the advertising companies he bought ad space off discovered that he was a cybercriminal. When the company confronted him, Zain antagonized them by threatening to harm the company's employees. Not to be intimidated, one of the ad companies reported to the police, in a rare case where the ad company was actually the hero. And that was when Zain's goose was cooked. The NCA got on his trail and worked with partners in the US, Canada, Europe, and the Crown Prosecution Service to track him down and arrest him. He was hit with 11 charges, including blackmail, fraud, computer offenses, and possessing criminal property. At first, Zain pled not guilty, but he eventually switched his plea and was sentenced to 6 years in jail. He was also ordered to pay back around £270,000 in restitution. Click to watch one of these next videos. Let us know in the comments section who your favorite fictional mob character ever portrayed was.